Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. So this last week, there was news out of the UK where the Prime Minister was facing a vote of confidence, but one from his own caucus and not from the House of Commons at large. And this is a little bit novel to Canadians because this is how our system should work, but it hasn't been. And throughout this, Conservative MP Michael Chong decided to chime in and remind people of his Reform Act, which is garbage legislation, but nevertheless, he was like, yay, we use this to oust Erin O'Toole, so the Liberals should sign on to its provisions so Justin Trudeau can face accountability. And there's a lot of problems with this particular notion, so I figured I can walk through some of those and explain why Chong is largely wrong and why his Reform Act is garbage legislation and why we should be returning to something more like the UK used to have. So first of all, some differences between how the UK and Canadian parliaments are somewhat structured is that they have dedicated backbench caucus committees for the Conservatives and the Labour Party in the UK. The Conservatives called this the 1922 Committee, which was actually formed in 1923. But it's where the backbenchers get together and kind of hash out their own views on things and legislation and so on. The Labour Party has their own similar structure called the Parliamentary Labour Party. And they, the backbenchers organize themselves apart from the frontbenchers. Whereas in Canada, our caucus meetings are the whole party, both frontbench and backbench. And once upon a time, the Liberals and the Conservatives also had senators in their caucuses as well. That's less the case with the Liberals these days because they officially don't have senators anymore. But the other thing that's different, I think, with Canada is that the party caucuses also have more regional sub-caucuses as well, which all helps to, feed issues towards the party leadership. But in this case, their backbenchers have a lot more autonomy than ours, which is something that we should be striving for, but it helps that they have almost twice as many MPs as Canada has. So that helps with the backbench autonomy there. It used to be the case up until recently in the UK that it was the backbenchers who would choose the party leader and then get rid of them when the leader was getting a bit long in the tooth, abusing their authority, or were becoming a liability. Canada, we haven't really done that since 1919 for the Liberals, and the Conservatives wasn't until somewhere in the 1920s. Because we came up with this notion about having party memberships choose the leader instead of the caucus, and that created a whole host of problems, not the least of which is the fact that party leaders are no longer accountable to their caucus. And so the role of MPs, and particularly backbenchers, was diminished, and leaders became insulated because they felt that they had some kind of a democratic mandate, which the rest of their caucus could not compete with. And that's created no shortage of problems ever since. This was the intention of what Michael Chong's bill was supposed to try and rebalance, was to ensure that backbenchers had more power from the leadership once again. The problem is that the entire notion is wrong. By trying to legislate and codify supposed powers that he's giving to backbenchers, he's actually limiting them by stealth, because backbenchers have never given up this power officially. The caucus could get rid of a leader at any particular time. They could call a non-confidence vote amongst themselves and vote their leader out at any particular junction, and they would not need the Reform Act or any other piece of legislation to codify how this works. Because the confidence principle is pretty sound if your caucus is not behind your leader. and they hold a vote to that account and demonstrate that the leader has, 50% or less of the caucus behind him or her, then that's a signal that it's time to start making a graceful exit, because they're going to turn on you in increasingly public ways. Now, part of the other problem with the Reform Act is that it created these thresholds to both hold these votes rather than allowing them to happen a little more organically, or for a few vocal members of the caucus to start speaking publicly and the leader getting the hint that way. No, they've created these barriers, these thresholds, and then to trigger a vote, and then the vote itself. And then that vote is really to hold a leadership review and so on. So it's not really accountability. It's not really putting the leader on notice. It's letting the leader fight it out amongst the general party membership as opposed to the caucus, which has its own particular host of problems, not the least of which is that a nebulous body of temporarily signed up party members is not a body that can hold any leader to account and is easily gamed. And we saw that happen in Manitoba a few years ago, where the premier was facing this pressure from caucus and held a leadership review and then won that. Hence, in an attempt to try and silence the caucus, and then things just spiraled out of control, and then they lost the next election. So the system as it works does not work. And Michael Chong chirping up every now and again saying, but I gave you the Reform Act. This is, these will give backbenchers more powers. Well, no, it doesn't actually give them powers, because they already had the powers, and trying to codify them ends up limiting those powers, because they think that they never had them before, which they did, and that they are circumscribed by this codification, which they are probably more expansive. But by creating this framework around them, it limits what powers the MPs have. And that's a problem, because MPs have a lot of powers that they don't generally exercise because they think they can't, because they don't know what their powers are. And this is partially why I have this whole section in my book about that. MPs have a lot of power that they have ceased exercising because they're not told what those powers are. One of the other things that comes with the rhetoric around the Reform Act was the notion that the Conservatives needed it to get rid of Stephen Harper because he was, tyrannical and so on. But the problem was that the caucus was never really against him because he was winning. And that whole narrative never really held, that, somehow they were chafing under it and they needed powers to push back against it, which is what a lot of, members from other parties were saying when they voted for this piece of legislation, in the assumption that it would be doing Parliament so much more good. And this is what Chong himself is falling into the same trap by insisting that the Liberals need to do this in order to hold Trudeau to account, as though he were somehow a tyrannical force over his own caucus, whereas for most Liberals, he's the reason they're there. He's the guy who won. And who helped them to win. At least in 2015, it's a little more that in the past couple of elections, many more of those MPs have won in spite of Trudeau, but nevertheless, Chong is projecting. A lot of Conservatives have this deep-seated hatred for Trudeau and seem to think that everyone else does as well, and that's partially why they keep losing elections, is because they can't fathom that other people don't feel this same well of hatred for him. So he's falling into the same trap that Liberals, Conservatives, Bloc MPs did when they voted for the Reform Act initially, and why we now have this garbage legislation on the books. So that's just another thing that we need to keep track of. Really, when it comes fundamentally down to it, we need to reform our systems and get them back to a place where the caucus would choose and get rid of leaders, because it empowers the MPs and it holds the leaders to account. It makes sure that there's a direct accountability mechanism so that they can't abuse their powers in the same way and can't say, oh, but I have the support of the grassroots membership, therefore you backbench MPs should shut up. That's not the way the system should be working. And as much as people like to think that this current system is more democratic, it's less accountable, and that counts for a lot, particularly in a parliamentary system like ours. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.